Let's do something slightly controversial, shall we? And talk about the anti-diet movement and body positivity, because I like criticism and a challenge. Okay, so let's start with what I think is good about this stuff, okay? I think it comes from a good place. I think it comes from a genuinely well-meaning place. I think it comes from want to make people feel cared for and included and not unnecessarily judged and not to unnecessarily feel shit about themselves. I think it wants to encourage people. I think it aims at all of that, and I see that as good. I think it'd be hard to argue that those things are a terrible idea, after all. But I think it also fails, depending on how you define it, and that actually matters, with some of the claims that some parts of it make, or some of the ideas, if they're taken to their nth degree, just run into some problems. The first one is possibly an idea that you should never feel shame about something. You should never feel bad about something. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think it's possible. And I don't think it's even something you mean if you were to say that. Whether you should feel shame for a lot of the things you do, that's different. But whether you should ever feel it, kind of a bit, it's a difficult one, right? Like if I went and just started jacking off in the street, I was like, should I feel shame for that? Should I feel shame if I just went and took a shit in a church whilst the vicar was talking? It's like, probably, yeah, probably I should. It'd be good, maybe, if we didn't all do that. Equally, when we're aiming to not feel so bad about ourselves for some of the food indulgences we make sometimes, because a lot of the time there is no reason to feel bad. We don't need to feel terrible when we have a chocolate bar unless we've defined a chocolate bar as bad somehow. And we might need to redefine what we mean as good and bad and health. And food isn't necessarily moral theology, okay? But I don't necessarily think that you can argue that it has nothing whatsoever to do at any degree. If, for example, we were all to engage in behaviour that looked like Christmas every single day, and we just ate everything in sight, and we just lay around in chronic pain because it was glorious, and we felt good every time we did that, we'd be more likely to repeat that behaviour. That's what emotions are there for. They reinforce behaviours. They either get you to repeat ones that feel good or try and avoid ones that feel bad. It's actually the purpose of emotions. So if you felt good every time you did something like that, you'd be more likely to do it. In the same way that if it felt fucking great just to be jacking off in the street, I'd be more likely to go and jack off in the street. Shame and some of those negative emotions are there to stop me doing those things. It's probably unsurprising, and maybe even sometimes good, that under certain circumstances we feel a bit, maybe I overdid that. Now, people can go way too far with that. They can beat themselves up over things that are really unnecessary and aren't necessarily all that moral. But I don't know that you can ever get to a point where you shouldn't ever experience any ill will or ill feeling because of the actions that you take. I don't know that we'd mean that. There is a point at which I think gluttony is real and that sloth is real. Now, you can't actually call anything in isolation gluttonous or slothful, I don't think. I don't think we'd call anyone who just finished the Tour de France slothful and lazy if they decide to lay on the couch for a week. I think they'd be like, yeah, fucking fair. Right? Equally, if someone comes out of prisoner of war camp, we're not going to call them gluttonous for wanting to eat a lot more. Okay? We make inferences based on everything else that's going on. And we might, and this is going to be controversial as well, make other inferences based on what we see in front of us. We can say that people who struggle with their weight, genuinely struggle with their weight, and they struggle for a whole bunch of biological, sociological, economical reasons. I'm not denying that for a moment or a second. But we can say that they clearly engage in types of behaviour that are hard to define as anything other than slightly gluttonous sometimes, because, well, the problem of obesity is a problem of excess energy on the body, so they had to do that over an extended period of time. Now, that could be slightly less frequent big indulgences, or it could be slightly small overeats over an extended period of time, or a combination of all those things. Whichever way you define it, they're consuming more than they need over an extended period of time, and that's how they get there. For whatever reasons that happens, it's multifaceted, but that's what's happened. And so, when we see a person in front of us, we make a bunch of inferences about them, and you're making a bunch of inferences about me right now. And if we watch a 200 kilo person ploughing through all the food, we make a slightly different inference, and we feel slightly differently about it, I think, most of the time, than if we see a 50 kilo person doing the same thing. And we do that because we recognize there's a difference in frequency amongst other things. Now, if you don't want to accept that, you'd also have to argue against this. I would say that it is more admirable. It's more something we go, wow, I'm so impressed, and that's overwhelmingly great, when we watch that same 200 kilo person run a marathon and finish a marathon, than if we watch the same 50 kilo person do the same thing. Both are clearly worthy of praise, but we recognize that there is an increased difficulty for the one person doing it. And we can only do that if we recognize a difference of sorts and we make a judgment of sorts. And so if you're going to have positive judgments, you have to have negative ones. They don't exist without each other. If we want praise, we have to have the other side of the coin. Again, we need to look at these things through a more reasonable, a more objective, a more rational lens. And we can't conclude good or bad from single isolation. We also can't conclude good or bad as a total person from acts that only really refer to a domain or two. Just because someone's obese doesn't mean that they're lazy. There are plenty of CEOs and really high-powered people busting their balls who are overweight. Can you call that lazy? I don't think you can. And if you can try, you should go and meet some. They're not really lazy people. They struggle with something. Equally, there are people who are in great shape, who are cuntbags of the highest order. You can be in great shape and be a morally reprehensible turd. And you can be a wonderful person, full of all the virtues under the sun and lack just in this one area. I sometimes think we have a problem of failing to differentiate criticism of one domain from criticism of the entirety of a being. And that is two different things. We have to separate that out from each other. You can critique one thing without throwing a whole person under the bus. Here's another thing that's common to hear. You are not your thoughts, you are not your actions, you're not your past behavior, you're not this, you're not that, right? Clearly you are a complex thing that's made of many, many things. I don't disagree, by the way. But I would add a word. You're not just your thoughts. You're not just your actions. You're not just your past behavior. Because I actually think you're all of those things. And I think you think it too. And the reason I think that is if I was to present to you a paedophile, or the classic internet argument, Adolf Hitler, and say, are they what they did? I don't think you would sit there and say you have no opinion. I don't think you say that it doesn't matter, right? I think you think it matters. So your behaviors and your thoughts and all the things that you are matter. And they matter clearly in magnitude and order, and I'm not trying to say, before anyone suggests, that anything related to food or the way you feel about yourself is the same as some of those crimes we might have just named. But these ideas have to exist on a continuum. They don't just not exist here, but only exist here. Otherwise, who gets to define where those lines are? We have to be in part, defined by our actions, as well as our thoughts and our intentions and all of those things. And so you're a really complex thing. And it's not clear who you are or what you are. I'm not saying I have a good answer for it, but I do think you can't be so confident in just saying you're not this, you're not that, you're not this. You're not just that. Thoughts don't necessarily define you. They're suggestions, they're ideas on something, they're reactions to something. You don't have to heed them. They're difficult to ignore sometimes. They're persuasive, they're stupid, they're funny, they're insightful, they're all of those things. And more often than not, you're all of those things. And if we then get into anti-diet, what does that mean? Diet really kind of means the way anyone eats. Now, you might define it differently, and you might have specific types of diet, and I can certainly go along for the ride and think there are better definitions of diet, more helpful ones, more inclusive ones, than ones that just make people feel shit for things they don't need to feel shit for, i.e. wine is fine unless you're deathly allergic to wine or plan on murdering someone in a vat of it. Chocolate, fucking fine, right? And again, unless you're gonna be dying every time you eat it, or just, you've got a huge dairy intolerance and you're gonna fart your way next to everyone you're near, in which case, if you're gonna have chocolate, do it alone, okay? That's all I'm asking. But to say that anyone is anti-diet, or anti-diet culture, that's another one to hear, I don't think you can actually be that, because culture is really the totality of the systems, ideas, habits, behaviors of a particular group or people. Even if you were to be so anti-diet, you're like, I don't eat any foods, that would actually be a culture of eating. So you can't get to a point where you're anti-diet culture. You can get to a particular definition anti-diet, yeah. And I think then we're probably all with you, in the same way that, you know, maybe most religious people believe in one God or one group of gods, and they don't believe in all the others. So they share a lot in common with atheists in that regard, other than just the extra one that the atheist doesn't believe in versus the others. To be anti-diet culture is, I think, more to say I'm against some of these particular definitions, rather than saying I'm against eating, because you can't be. And to say that diet culture promotes an unattainable, unrealistic, thin image that no one can get near is somewhat true, but it's not completely true, because there are some people who look like that. They're often the people on the adverts, and you can say that they're airbrushed and edited, and maybe they only look like that on the day, and fair enough, there's some truth to all those things. But those people still exist, and they are human beings. And if you're going to say that what they represent isn't real, or is unfair, or is unattainable, you are to criticize them as well. And I don't think that really means then the all-inclusive thing that this thing started out aiming at being. And so it falls short of its own standard, I think, if it does such a thing. Sometimes you hear it argued that thinness equals higher status and just being a better person in general. And it's right to acknowledge that as a fallacy. Just because you're thin, we've been over, doesn't mean you're a good person. But babies do it. If you get babies an attractive face and a less attractive face, they pick the attractive face. So it's hard to say that that's a socially conditioned, or at least a purely socially conditioned response. Not to say we shouldn't be aware of it, not to say we shouldn't aim at things that recognize that thinness doesn't mean too much else, but this health halo effect is a real psychological phenomenon. You can't just get rid of it because you decide you don't like it. And currently, one of my least favorite parts of the certain parts of the body positivity movement is I think they attack things in the same manner that they criticize. So the idea is nothing should be shamed, because shame doesn't help behavior change. Fair enough, I'm with you, I've seen the data, I'm not disputing that. What I'm disputing is sometimes the hypocrisy with which it's applied. There's an attack on anyone who disagrees or voices another idea or questions anything. And it's just calling people names. It's calling them dumb and morons and just this white guy who said that. And it's like, so you're trying to shame someone into not shaming, because shaming doesn't change behavior, but I'm gonna do it anyway. And look, just because someone's being hypocritical actually doesn't change whether their argument is valid. I get that too. I get that we're human. I get that we make mistakes and we get emotional and we get frustrated. But if those things are true, then surely we should be applying them to other people. Unless we don't really want to have a conversation with them, or we just want to feel morally self-righteous. Maybe we should be a bit less certain within ourselves. The data is quite clear that shaming decreases people's inclination towards change. But there's data also showing that when we let body positivity run a bit of amok, without any criticism, that it increases the acceptance of ever bigger sizes. Or at least it plausibly does such a thing. I've seen at least 3 papers showing that. And to me that sort of suggests we've got to combine these things. That shaming people doesn't necessarily lead to change, but complete acceptance doesn't seem to lead to change either. And either we're saying there's completely nothing wrong on any domain with any size, and I don't think you can say that, because you can starve to death, so that means there's too thin. And I don't know anyone who works in any medical field who doesn't think there are certain problems with obesity at a certain point. So there might be a happy range somewhere in here. And on some level, who am I to say where you should be? I accept that argument. It's kind of one where I come from. It is your life, you can do what you like with it. But I'm also aware that there's a counter-argument to that point too, which is that if that were the case and everyone acted in that manner, and everyone got ever larger, the burden that places on social systems, we live in the UK so it's the NHS, becomes unbearable. And that then does affect me and you and everyone else. So it's not the case that sometimes doing whatever you like doesn't affect other people. But where that line is, either in the range that people are fine and healthy at, I don't know. How many people would need to behave in that manner for it to be a problem? I don't know. But I do know that we've got this conundrum, and I don't think we can just ignore evidence on either side. I'm not even saying it's even amounts of evidence. I'm also going to say that shaming isn't a clear act. There are types of action that are very clearly cunty. If I went up to someone on the street and just started calling them names and just a fat disgrace and blah, and then I threw up in my mouth and I slapped them and left. Pretty hard to argue on anything other than a cunt there, isn't it? But then there are certain things where it's down to interpretation. I've had plenty of clients and lots of experience with people who have lost weight only for their friends and spouses to be affected and upset with the change they made. They felt threatened by it. Is that what the intent of that person was? Not necessarily. But we compare ourselves inevitably to the people in our groups. If we are next to someone with a lot of money, we feel poor. If we're next to someone who's really smart, we feel dumb. If we're next to someone who's really, really attractive, we feel ugly as balls. That's not necessarily those people's intent, and yet I can feel shamed by it. But does that mean that I'm right in my interpretation of such a thing? Not necessarily. My interpretation is affected by what I pay attention to, by my history in life, by my personality type, by how hot it is, how tired I am, how hungry I am, the language that I've heard around me, whether or not I've engaged in anything like CBT, whether I know anything about certain psychological treatments and effects. All of these things play a role in how I view a situation that's in front of me right now. And that means we cannot accept by itself the fact that someone felt shamed to be a reason that we have to do something about it. It's not that they're wrong. I can't say that they shouldn't feel shame in that situation, but I equally can't say that they should without knowing more about the situation. And that's true for everyone. Your feelings might be right, but they might be wrong. And you need to actually analyze that, and you need to learn to analyze that if we're to change stuff. It is not that shaming isn't a real thing. It's not that it sucks to feel ashamed. It's not that some people aren't cunts. It's not that we shouldn't aim for a better world full of kinder people. But we shouldn't conclude that everyone's an asshole. We shouldn't conclude that we have a horrifically oppressive diet culture. We shouldn't conclude that body positivity has no negative facets. We need a more nuanced debate. We need one that understands we can have conversations from many sides. Aristotle once said that it was the mark of an educated mind to discuss an idea without accepting it. Let's not lose that. If we want to come up with effective solutions, really helpful ones, we have to think about what is good and bad in situations, and maybe what's in the grey. And we have to flesh it out, and hopefully not take those things so personally, and not think that the solution that applies to us necessarily applies to everyone, but it might. But the only way we'll figure out which ones are person-specific, which ones are broader principles, which ones work, which ones don't, is conversation, is debate. And it's doing so from a genuine place. A place that doesn't put yourself on a pedestal and think that everyone else sucks because they disagree with you or because they critique you. Let's have a conversation. I fucking love a good conversation. I'm hopefully coming at it from a good place. I like debate. So if you've got some, hit me with it. Let's get somewhere with this.